Members of the Nebraska legislature heard debate about a proposed bill that would add a new method of execution when it comes to the state's death penalty. Right now, the only legal way to execute an inmate on death row is by lethal injection. However, Nebraska doesn't have access to the drugs necessary to make that happen. Because of this, Senator Lauren Lippincott of Central Nebraska is seeking to add asphyxiation by nitrogen gas to the list of execution methods. Shortly after introducing the bill, the senator told 6 News this method is the most, in his view, accessible and humane way to carry out the death penalty. Death penalty was reinstated by voters in 2016. However, when the bill appeared in committee this week, no one was there to support it except for the senator himself.
You might not yet be open to the conclusion that we need to make it harder to execute people, but I hope you can at least understand that an act as serious and irreversible as taking a life should never be made easier.
If today's senators vote in favor of capital punishment, then they should take accountability for their votes by committing the state-sponsored homicide themselves.
Right now, it's unclear if the proposed bill will make it onto the legislative floor. Nebraska's last execution took place in 2018.